Second area I just want to look at is the use of e-cigarettes and extending the regime and imposing potential criminal sanctions and obligations on individuals. And I suppose it all comes down to the proportionality test that is used in evaluating whether something meets or breaches human rights law, particularly the European Convention. Now, I think the thrust behind this bill is an effort, in part, to denormalise smoking, and that the actions you wish to take against e-cigarettes are inspired largely by this desire. But the whole concept of denormalising is a fairly nebulous one. I'm not saying it's unimportant, but it obviously is not an easy one to pin down in evidence. And in fact, the English Department of Health has not taken this view. So how do they sit in terms of the proportionality test, given that, potentially you could get clobbered by this legislation if you foolishly don't. I mean, every citizen, of course, should obey the law. We're not denying that. But it's a serious sanction that is being proposed here.
Yes, Chair, thank you. I have to explain a bit about the policy issue. I know that policy is not the primary province of the committee, but taking up your point, I have to explain something of the policy in order to explain the proportionality of it. So our policy is very simple. It is that in future, in Wales, if this bill is passed, e-cigarettes will be able to be used everywhere that a conventional cigarette can be used, and won't be able to be used anywhere where a conventional cigarette cannot be used. We advance that policy on 3 grounds. One, on enforcement, that in order to enforce the law effectively, the law is undermined when people can claim to have been using an e-cigarette rather than a conventional cigarette. It's why e-cigarettes are already banned in places like the Union Stadium, the Liberty Stadium, the Swalec Stadium, anywhere where there are large crowds. Those responsible for enforcing the law concluded it is easy to enforce it where the law is simple and consistent. But we also believe that allowing e-cigarettes to be used in places where conventional cigarettes cannot be used has the potential to renormalise smoking. And given that we have spent so many years doing our very best to make smoking an activity that is not thought of as socially acceptable or normal, we don't want to do anything that will potentially undermine that position. The evidence for renormalisation, I concede, is contested, and people take different views of it. As Health Minister, I believe it is my duty to take a precautionary approach, and where there is evidence of harm or potential harm, that we shouldn't wait to see whether that harm has actually been realised. We should act to prevent its possibility. Policy, therefore, of the Welsh Government, which may not be consistent with Public Health England, and its report, which the Lancet, I see in its editorial, described as based on extraordinarily flimsy foundations. Our policy is consistent with that advocated, for example, by the British Medical Association, the World Health Organization, and a whole range of other very responsible and respectable medical organisations. So,
completely accept that your assessment of the available evidence may be more robust than the English Department of Health, and there are probably English lawmakers that are going to scrutinise the ministers in charge of delivering health in England. I just wonder, though, if in abstract evidence, the consensus were to emerge that e-cigarettes are not harmful, would your policy then still be justified in terms of enforcement in your view?
Well, we will be in a different debate. I concede that. I think when you read in the medical journals like the BMJ and so on, and you look at the Cochrane Collaborative, which is the most robust assessor of evidence in the medical field, they suggest it will be a decade before there is definitive evidence as to whether or not e-cigarettes act as a gateway to smoking for young people, as there is very persuasive evidence in other places, or as a route to renormalisation. If in 10 years' time the evidence was clear that they do not operate in that way, then I would imagine anybody's position would want to reassess the position. Whether the enforcement argument by itself will be enough to sustain the law as we would like to see it, I think you could only assess that at the time. My position, as you know, is that I am not prepared for, in a decade's time, the evidence to show that harm that could have been avoided, particularly to young people, had occurred when we're in a position to avoid it happening in the first place.
You see, your position is the precautionary approach is justified and is proportionate.
Yeah.
So we can note that. And